first of all, thank you to Diana and the Creative Mornings team for having me today. Creative Mornings has a special place in my heart because I'm from New York, and we definitely attended a lot of Creative Mornings back in New York. And so, will this work with this?
Yeah, it's like the thing.
And so certainly great to have Creative Mornings here in Hong Kong. As Ben mentioned, I've only been here in Hong Kong for about a year, so it's been an incredible journey so far. And as you know, head of product at SCMP. SCMP, we are on this new mission, although we are a 115-year-old newspaper of record here in Hong Kong. We're on this new mission to become a global media company and to lead the global conversation about China. And so our product team comprises of about 55 people or so, of product designers, product managers, software engineers, and partnerships as well. And we're in charge of every single externally facing consumer product that involves experiences of consuming news and consuming content. So whether that be websites, whether that be mobile apps, or any other types of medium or format that you can think of. So we're experimenting with a lot of different things, from audio to smart speakers, virtual reality, things on the blockchain, things like that. So I know for some of you, you may have gotten opportunities to see the office this morning, so at least some of you got to tour that. If you have not, don't worry, there's definitely going to be other opportunities to do so. You're more than welcome to always come back. We have a happy hour every single Friday here in the office, Friday afternoons, and we're always open to holding more events like this. If you love the office so much that you want to stay here, we're definitely hiring. So hiring across the board and across the company. In fact, we have a lot of folks around the room that are from the company, so just a quick raise of hands if you work at SCMP. There we go, a lot of them are in the back corner over there. So if you see them around the room, after this, say hi, see what they're up to. We have representation from product, from magazines, from marketing, and different other departments as well. So without further ado, I want to talk a little bit about organized chaos. And first of all, what exactly is chaos? When you hear the word chaos, sometimes it might conjure up feelings about confusion, disorder, maybe mess, maybe a little bit of rebellion, some disarray, certainly some craziness, right? And I mentioned that when I first moved to Hong Kong, prior to moving to Hong Kong, I lived in this beautiful city, San Francisco. San Francisco, as you know, is in Northern California, Silicon Valley, and my morning commutes generally look like this, right? It's very bright and blue skies, nice sea breeze, and I could take the tram, or we called it the trolley, and a very pleasant experience. And then I came to Hong Kong, and my morning commutes were something like this. All right, welcome to the MTR. A lot of crowds, a lot of people, very hectic, very, very crazy, sometimes stressful, and definitely a little chaotic. So this is something that definitely came to mind when I initially heard the theme of chaos. Other things that come to mind, show of hands, how many of you have maybe desks or rooms that might look a little bit like this? No? Okay, lots of people. Yeah, so certainly very, very disorganized, right? Not really sure what's happening here. Definitely a little bit of craziness, and certainly a little chaotic. And then the third example I wanted to provide is this. So this past year was my first time actually in China. I had never really lived in Asia before as well. And one of the many things I noticed in China, lots of interesting things, but one of the things was this. An intersection where it seemed like there was no sense of traffic lights, there's no sense of rules, and I didn't really understand. I was shocked. I didn't really understand what was happening here. I didn't understand how this could possibly work, and it just seemed crazy, right? And so this was one of my first experiences with experiencing China in a way. Yeah, you can see lots of people, like pedestrians, motorcycles, cars, all going in separate, different ways. And so, in hearing about the theme about chaos, I was also reminded of a recent story that I heard. I'm super into music myself, And this person here, his name is Keith Jarrett. He is a world-renowned American jazz musician. And in January 1975, he was scheduled to perform a solo recital in Cologne, Germany, in the Cologne Opera House in Germany. Keith had basically come all the way from Zurich. He had performed a show in Zurich the night before, and he was, basically took this long 5-6 hour journey from Zurich to Cologne to perform this recital. And he was scheduled to perform in front of a sold-out show, 1,500 people. And a lot of trouble happened during this journey that he had. Number one, he didn't get much sleep the night before because of the long journey. He arrived in Cologne, and hours before the show, he went to dinner, and there were some issues with the restaurant for some reason, and he didn't really get that much to eat either. So certainly under a lot of stress, certainly under a lot of pressure, certainly under a lot of exhaustion. Furthermore, he had a bad back, and so he was actually physically wearing a brace to cope with his back. So a lot of physical pain as well, not just mental stress. But what made this worse is that when he showed up in the opera house, he, during sound check and whatnot, was looking at some of the equipment that he'd be using. And he's a pianist, so he was looking at the piano he was using. And initially, he had asked for a very specific instrument, an imperial grand piano. What he got instead, there was unfortunately a mistake with the opera house. They thought that he had asked for a baby grand piano. And so that's what they had at the opera house, and that's what they provided. But he took one look at it, and he understood immediately, and he realized immediately that this is not what he asked for, right? Because an imperial grand piano is one of the only pianos in its size that could actually fill the volume and fill the room of a large opera house. A baby grand doesn't have that same capability. But furthermore, this baby grand piano was one that they had primarily used for just practice. It was pretty much worn out. The pedals weren't working, the black keys were sticking, the white keys were out of tune. The upper registers sounded very, very tinny and very, very thin because the felt was sort of already worn out. The bass registers were not loud, it's very weak. And so he as he was walking around the piano and played a couple keys, he immediately knew there's no way he can play on this. And he spoke to the promoter, and he's like, this is not what I asked for. Can I get another one? And they said, well, unfortunately, we only have a couple of hours until the show. They tried calling around all over town, and they just could not get another piano in time. Now they were able to find a tuner, and they were able to call a tuner to try to at least fix it, and maybe spend the next couple of hours to try to fix it. But from his perspective, that's not acceptable, right? And I think I can kind of empathize with him, because especially, I'm a musician myself, I'm a DJ, and so I can't play with other people's equipment because it's just not set up the way I want it to be. And if it's not set up the way I want it to be and I'm not used to it, I can't perform with confidence, I can't perform to the level that I'm expected to. So similarly, certainly for a professional musician, that's very, very understandable, right? So he's like, yeah, I don't think this is going to work out. We might have to cancel the show. And that's a big deal, right? Because again, 1,400 people are expected to come here. And there's no way you can cancel. Especially because the promoter for the show was this 17-year-old German student. She was the youngest promoter in Germany at the time. And this was kind of one of her big shows that she had organized. And Keith had said, yeah, there's no way I can do this, I'm leaving, right? And so he left, he went in his car, waited in his car. And this 17-year-old was like frantically on the phone trying to call people and saying like, yeah, the only thing we can get is a tuner, and that's it. Until finally she just ran outside towards the car. It was pouring rain outside, just standing in the rain. She walks up to Keith's car, knocks on the window, and she was basically begging him to stay, right? And you can just imagine the 17-year-old student in the rain, crying, stressed out, begging him to stay. For some reason, she eventually convinced him. And he looked at her and he's like, all right, I'll stay, right? Because of you, I'll stay. And he had a little bit of pity for her, and he decided to do that. But certainly inside, right, he was also super nervous and trying to think, like, how exactly am I going to do this? And so as the show started, he immediately sort of began to play. Let's see if you can hear a little bit of it. And so one of the things that he did was he had to improvise. Right, so you notice that he started basically avoiding the upper registers, and he played primarily in the middle. And so the sound that actually came out was very soothing, was very calm, this ambient sound. Another thing that he did was, you notice in the picture, he was standing up pretty much the entire time, because he needed to bang on the lower registers so that the volume would actually reach the end of the opera hall. And he had to do this rolling, sort of like keys, if you will, almost in a percussion style, just to make it work. And so he had to basically change his style. And so, fortunately, the entire crowd loved it. And to the crowd, they had no idea about this whole backstory. They had no idea that he was using piano that he wasn't intended to use, right? And to him, it wasn't perfect, because he understands, he can hear it. Like the tuners, they were able to tune the piano, but certainly it was worn out enough that there's no way to fix that. So he could still feel that this is not up to par. But the audience, didn't realize that, I think. And the audience actually accepted it very, very well. And so this sort of proves that great things can happen in spite of chaos. And in fact, the recording for this concert ended up being the best-selling solo jazz album and the best-selling piano album in history. And that still holds true today. So it's really interesting to see that, in spite of chaos, great things can definitely happen. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how, we have a natural tendency of wanting to reverse, wanting to prevent and bring order to chaos. We as humans, there's this instinct that chaos is bad, chaos is maybe negative, and there's this instinct that we want to fix it. You see this a lot in corporations, you see this a lot in organizations. In fact, the word organization in itself, right, refers to order. We enjoy planning and perfectly executing against that plan. Feels great, right, when we do that. We find comfort in process and structure and the status quo, and creating rules and creating policies. But so, I feel that chaos is a necessary ingredient, particularly for creativity, for innovation, for change. We really need to learn how to realize that chaos is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, sometimes it's a necessary thing. Sometimes it can be helpful. And sometimes we need to learn that and appreciate that there are times where chaos can contribute to something amazing and something great and something magical. Right? In fact, there's this community out there called Burning Man. Right? I don't know if you're familiar with Burning Man. One of the mantras of Burning Man is always saying yes. Right? And so to someone new to that community, it sounds very, very weird. Right? If you're not familiar with Burning Man, it's effectively this arts, music, community festival in Nevada. And saying yes all the time. Right? Whenever an opportunity comes in front of you, whenever someone asks you to do something, you're running into a stranger, someone asks you to do something, just don't think about it, just say yes. And so certainly that's risky, certainly that's crazy, it sounds crazy, because anything can happen. But that's part of the magic, that's part of the charm, right? And that's part of what creates serendipity, that's part of what creates adventure. And so I think this entire concept of chaos, and how I like to call organized chaos, is certainly a necessity when it comes to creativity. It's a necessity in our process of creating, in our process of designing, in our process of wanting to change and wanting to bring innovation. Let me give you an example of something that exists in the world in terms of design. So this is a ball, right? Imagine a ball, like a ping pong ball or a golf ball, that is super smooth, has no blemishes whatsoever, right? It's perfect. And if you threw this ball across the air, it effectively would, the air would create some sort of resistance to it, right? But because the ball is super smooth, the air basically gets separated from the surface and creates this drag behind it. And this drag, or it's called a wake as well, it effectively slows down the ball as it's moving through the air, right? But imagine if you were to design this ball a little bit differently, and specifically for a golf ball, there's dimples in it. So they've introduced effectively disruption in it. They've introduced imperfection in it. And so what this actually does is each of these dimples, each of these blemishes and holes creates a little bit of turbulent air. So when the air hits it, turbulence happens, right? And when we hear turbulence, we typically associate that with planes, which is bad. But in this case, it's very, very good because the turbulent air forces the air to separate from the surface of the ball much faster, much earlier, thus creating less drag and a thinner wake. So if you were to hit a smooth golf ball, it would only reach half the distance as a dimpled golf ball. Right? So an example of maybe in design of how introducing some quote unquote something imperfect in a way of what seems to be imperfect, something that seems a little bit more chaotic, but actually it produces something that performs a lot better. And so the author Malcolm Gladwell once said, embracing intellectual messiness goes against our human instincts and our training as educated people. But writers, artists, creators, we should accept and understand it as something critical to the creative process. And so, this whole concept then is how can we embrace chaos? Why should we embrace chaos? How can we introduce chaos into our daily lives, particularly if we're creative, particularly if we're trying to change something, particularly if we're trying to introduce something to the world, and particularly if we're trying to innovate and challenge the status quo. So the mathematician Doan Farmer coined the term edge of chaos. This is the concept of how there's actually a lot of things in the world that benefit from being in the edge of chaos, meaning it's sort of that balance between order and chaos, right? You can't have too much of one thing. You can't have too much order because then it's too restrictive. But then certainly too much chaos is also not necessarily good. And so this edge of chaos, whether it's it involves dual thinking, it involves concept of convergence and divergence, the concept of both control and abandon, order and disorder, certainty and uncertainty. And this edge can look weird. In fact, it usually looks weird, but it can also eventually become the center. There's a prominent VC named Chris Dixon. He wrote a post a long time ago about how how a lot of inventions, a lot of things that we use today, a lot of successful products that we use today, initially just look like toys, right? Initially looked like something weird. Initially looked like something funny. A lot of people would dismiss it, but then eventually became something interesting, right? Maybe a classic example of recent times might be something like Snapchat, might be something else, where initially you looked at it, it's like, this is poorly designed. This is terrible. Why would anyone use this? Why would you have a product? Why would you have an app that has zero navigation that's showing, right? I don't even understand, people would not understand how to use it. But this eventually became almost the norm. A lot of people started using that format. Instagram stories basically copied that format, right? And a lot of other companies took that as inspiration, took that as something to copy. And so this is, again, an instance where something that looked weird initially, something that looked way off base, eventually became the center. So how exactly can we introduce chaos then? So, start from the beginning, from a fresh perspective. Don't be afraid to go back to the drawing board. Don't be afraid to reinvent the system. We have to reinvent ourselves again and again and again in order for us to not stay comfortable, in order for us to not stay locked in, and in order for us to constantly innovate, right? Allow for a high volume of ideas, no matter how bad or good. The high volume of ideas is a good process to go through, right? So when you're brainstorming, no idea is a bad idea, right? When you're brainstorming, throw everything on the wall and then sort it out later. Because the first idea is usually not the best one. And you want to try and push through the low-hanging fruit. You want to push through the easy ones. There's a lot of things that's obvious maybe, a lot of things that's easy. And so get those out of the way and then start coming up with the radical ones, come up with the crazy ones, come up with the different ones. Let yourself wander and daydream, right? So if you're ever in a state where you feel like you're distracted a little bit, something catches your eye, let it happen, right? Again, the whole concept of saying yes to everything. But more importantly, feel secure about it. A lot of people try to resist it, right? Again, it's a natural human instinct to resist if I'm daydreaming. But we need to sometimes let it happen. And failing fast. So don't be afraid of failure. Try things. And failure is okay. Failure is the whole process of being able to discover something great. In fact, a lot of people don't judge you by how many times you fail. In fact, they'll probably just remember the things that you succeed at, right? There's tons and tons of examples out there in the world of super successful people that have failed. You know, Michael Jordan, Oprah, even Steve Jobs was fired from his own company and came back, right? Lots of examples out there of people failing fast. Design teams that are cross-functional, that are very diverse, and more importantly, flat information structures. So make sure that your teams are comprised of people from different backgrounds, different functions, people coming from different perspectives. Hire people that challenge you. Scott Belsky, he's the founder of a company called Behance. He said, you have to have a team around you that thinks unreasonably. They say things that sound crazy, right? So there's this whole notion, particularly in Silicon Valley, where people talk about culture. People talk about hiring for culture. And that can be a little bit dangerous because sometimes when people say hire for culture, they really mean people like me. Hire people that look like me, people that feel like me. But when you do that, you end up with people just basically like you, the entire team, right? And that doesn't really create diversity. That doesn't really create a team that thinks outside the box, that thinks outside your circle, right? So sometimes it's good to have people that challenge you. Sometimes it's good to have people that seem a little bit unreasonable, a little crazy. Marketer Seth Godin calls this making a ruckus, right? Effectively introducing a little bit of disruption, introducing a little bit of chaos into the organization. This is similar to adding a random variable to things, whether it be adding a random variable when you're brainstorming, right? So when you're starting to brainstorm, think about the crazy ideas so that you're not stuck in this local maxima. It's very easy for us to try to always increase and iterate 10% here, 10% here, 10% here. But what this actually can create is this concept of local maxima where you're just always going to hit the maximum opportunity in that scope, in that sphere, and you're never able to go above and beyond or outside of that box. So adding a random variable during your process helps with that. This also applies to people, right? There's studies out there where they'll ask a group of 4 people, let's say 4 friends, who all know each other, to brainstorm some solutions to a problem. And they compare that to maybe a group of strangers that were tasked of solving the same exact problem. And the group of friends, they had a very good time. They knew each other. They went out for some beers to solve the problem. They came up with some great ideas. The strangers had a little bit more of a struggle, right? Because you have to introduce yourself. You're not really sure how to act in front of other people. And coming back, the study found that the ideas that these strangers came up with were actually much more innovative, much more quote unquote better. But in other words, they came up with ideas that were a little bit non-obvious, but also solved the problem in a very elegant way. But what was key with this is that how people felt about it. So the strangers, despite of having come up with more innovative ideas, they actually did not feel confident at all. They were worried. They were like, there's no way that this team, we don't know each other, I don't really understand how to work with this team. I'm not really sure if our ideas are any good. The friends, however, were super confident. They're like, yes, we're amazing. We came up with the best ideas. And it's that reaction, it's that feeling, maybe misplaced confidence in a way, that's dangerous. And so this concept's also brought in by Clayton Christensen in his book, Innovator's Dilemma. Right? It's the whole concept, again, of if you're too stuck in this comfort zone, if you're too stuck in just trying to optimize some of the things that you've already created, you can never innovate. This is why a lot of startups are usually the ones to leapfrog large companies. It's very hard for large companies to constantly innovate because they get into this large organization that tries to perhaps cater to the masses within the company, or maybe there's a concept of groupthink within the company. So it's hard for them to see outside the box. Introducing constraints. So constraints and restrictions breed creativity. There's examples of this in Adam Grant's book called Originals. He talks about different artists like Da Vinci. He talks about leaders like MLK. Both of these folks, super procrastinators in the work that they do. In fact, MLK was up before his speech, 3 a.m. the night before, apparently, still working on his speech, and even down to the last minute, he was still scribbling stuff before he walked on stage. And the famous line was not even part of the script at all. It's something that he just kind of came up with on the spot. In design, right? So one of the things that we try to do within design teams and the design process is, again, introducing constraints or introducing disruption or randomness to the process. If you're a designer, you can probably design, if you didn't have a deadline, you could probably design forever, right? You can always come up with ideas. But by introducing constraints, if we said, okay, you have 2 weeks to come up with something, then that constraint itself helps with the process, right? Or sometimes if you're always working here in the office as a designer, go outside once a week. Go work from a different environment. Go work in a coffee shop. Go take a walk in the park. Unlock your brain a little bit. This gives yourself time to consider divergent ideas, think in nonlinear ways, and make those unexpected leaps, right? Effectively improvising when you need to improvise. And so remember that desk I showed earlier. So when you think about this desk now in the context of organized chaos, right? I actually see this as how Albert Einstein said, if a cluttered desk is a sign of cluttered mind, what then is an empty desk a sign of? But to me, it's like when I look at a cluttered desk or a messy room, it can sometimes be, again, the coin termed organized chaos, right? Where to an outsider, it might look messy. But to the person, it's perfect because I know exactly where everything is. And in fact, if I think my mom would do this when I was young, right? She would clean up my room or organize my room, and it would disrupt everything I was doing in a way because I suddenly didn't know where things were. All right, so that's that concept. Or back to this traffic, right? So when you look at this really, really closely, you realize that it works. You realize that despite not having rules, despite not having people obeying traffic lights, it just works. And in fact, there's been a lot of studies done in cities and countries around the world, whether it be Amsterdam or Hanoi or even in Germany, where they tried experimenting by removing traffic lights. They removed stoplights. And it forced people to actually then think. It forced people to actually consider other people on the road. People's cars started slowing down. And what ended up happening was there was less accidents, less injuries, and it was actually a much better situation. So again, to an outsider looking at it, it's like, it sounds crazy, it seems way too chaotic. But if you really look down the details, that in some situations, it can actually work really, really well. And so I wanted to close with just this short video.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Embrace chaos. Thank you.
Thanks, Malcolm. Thank you, Malcolm. I'd be curious to see how that traffic light thing works in Hong Kong. We're going to do a bit of a Q&A, so I know we're running a little bit behind, but if you want to stay for that, please do. If not, totally understanding if you have to go. More oxygen for us. But Malcolm, if you want to come back up here, does anyone have a question to start out with?
Thanks, Malcolm, for the talk, and thanks to everyone at SEMP. I was wondering, moving from a traditional media company to now a global platform where things might be structured differently in the past, what are some of the things that you guys are doing to foster chaos and hence creativity?
Yeah. So certainly one of the things that we're doing is starting with a common language, right? So if you see the yellow posters around the room, or as you were going through our office, you'll see yellow posters all around the room. One of the first things that we did was identify a new mission and vision, so everyone can understand the goal that we're trying to achieve, right? Our vision is to elevate thought, and our mission is to lead the global conversation about China. So everyone's on the same page as exactly what's that flag down the road that we're trying to accomplish. And number two, we redefined the language that we use in how we work, so in the form of company values, right? But this is effectively, and it sounds a little bit cheesy and a little bit, but effectively this is a common language that we use of understanding how we feel that we want to work and how we feel that we want our teams to work together and to collaborate. So again, that was step number one. Step number two was shifting our focus from being seeing ourselves as a news or content company in a way to being more of a product-driven company. And I say that because we want to be able to understand why we're writing news, why we're creating content, and understand how we can deliver this, how we can package it in an experience that matters to the end consumer and the end user. Because certainly content by itself is no longer king. You know, we're in a world now where people are consuming content in multiple different ways and however that they want, whether that be through a print paper, whether it's through a website, whether it's through an audio speaker, whether it's through in their car. And we have to cater to all those different experiences. We have to know how to personalize those experiences. Organizationally, you can see this new office, one of the things that we did as well. And again, it sounds like something that's not a big deal, but it does make a difference. You know, the whole feeling of being in the office, the whole feeling of a floor plan that's a little bit more open. The first time the entire editorial team is sitting, you know, all together in the center of our office, right? If you saw the picture or you did the tour on the 18th floor, we have that oval of the mastheads, the editorial mastheads, mass leaders, and that represents effectively the heart of SEMP. So that whole notion that now there should no longer be these walls that we throw work over, right? There should just simply be collaboration. And so we form cross-functional teams. For example, the product team, every single product that we work on, whether it be SEMP.com, whether it be Inkstone or Abacus or GoldThread or some of these other brands that we've launched, each one is organized and with one product manager, an engineering manager, a team of engineers, a team of designers, we have analysts, we have marketers that are all working on that one thing. So effectively trying to create as much of a startup within a larger company. Now I know it's not the same as a startup, but as much of an autonomous team as we can. Giving that team ownership into the product that they're working on. Understanding they have to be data driven, understanding that they have to understand exactly what how the customers are using it. So empowering them to be able to do this. So I think there's a lot of things that we're certainly trying to employ, and we're going to continue to have to improve through this process. But that's the journey that we've been on, this transformation that we've been on. And certainly it's a process that comes both bottom up and top down. right? It can't just be the CEO saying, hey, we have to do this, and that's it. You have to get people to believe. You have to get them to want to do this themselves. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Anyone else?
Hi, yes, thank you for especially the story about the music. I thought that was incredible. One of the questions I had for you, can you elaborate a little more? You talked about introducing the variable. Do you have an example of that either in this role or a previous role, how besides getting a random group of people together to come up with the ideas, what does it look like practically in your role or with your teams to introduce that variable? What does it look like?
Yeah, I think it's, as long as you believe in the concept of always introducing variables to your process and always realizing that things can change, things will always change, things should change. So step number one in your brainstorming process, right? Allow any ideas to come in. Be a sponge. It doesn't matter where the ideas are coming from. Certainly, you should be talking to your customers. Certainly, you should be working with your coworkers here. But it's very easy for us, for anyone in a company, to get comfortable in just our circle, right? Effectively designing within the four walls of a room and not thinking about any other inputs, not thinking about the outside. So number one is being a sponge and letting those ideas come in. Number two is during the process realizing that you could always be wrong the entire time. And so get a feedback loop happening. So as you're working on products, as you're launching things, launch it very, very quickly with trying to optimize on learning, right? Optimize on getting feedback, optimize on learning. Not this huge, don't spend like 12 months working on something in closed doors with a team of quote unquote like talented designers and then come out at the end of 12 months and then realizing that you worked on the wrong thing, right? So spend a lot of time gathering feedback and being more in the real world. Introducing random variables. So yes, that comes in the process of both how you design. So I mentioned, we get designers to go out of the office sometimes, right? Take a walk. You hear terms about like writer's block, right? Designers have the same thing. Creatives have the same thing. Sometimes you just get in a rut. Sometimes it requires you to sleep on it and come back to it the next morning. Sometimes you just need to escape a little bit and not think of it, right? And come back to it. For a lot of people, this is very difficult, right? For a lot of people, I can't write something and maybe like stop mid-sentence and then not come back to it until 2 weeks later. A lot of people, this will always bother them. But in fact, that the fact that it bothers you is good. The fact that it's in the back of your mind is good, right? And you hear actually terms of how procrastinators actually, this is almost ingrained in their process because they have this thing in the back of their mind, but they don't touch it. And they sometimes can perform a lot better under pressure. They perform a lot better with that constraint, right? And then again, speaking of pressure and speaking of constraints, introduce those manufactured restrictions, those manufactured constraints. Whether it be in the form of deadlines, whether it be in the form of whatever, you effectively want to draw a sandbox of where you should be designing, where you should be playing, and you want to play within that sandbox, right? But then after you're done with that sandbox, then move on to a completely different sandbox to play in. So those are, I know I'm speaking in more abstract terms, but those are effectively the strategies you have to employ. One of the things that we're trying to do in the office as well is for example, so we have two offices split right now, one in Times Square and one in Taipo. And the majority of the product team is actually in Taipo. And it's a super old office, certainly does not feel like this, right? And so one of the things that we wanted to create in that area was effectively what I like to call a creative corner. You can imagine if an old school, stodgy, cubicle style office had this like corner of it where there was just grass on the floor, you have a bunch of art or plants all over, and as you enter, it's a completely different world. That's effectively the practice of disconnecting, right? It's effectively disconnecting from your normal environment, and then hopefully that will help unlock some creativity in there. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great.
All
Thank
right.
you.
One last question. I think there's someone in the back. If not, we will close. No?
What's your DJ name?
So it's not public really. It's DJ Static, spelled with a K at the end. And it's interesting because it's sort of almost like the concept of organized chaos, because static can mean stasis, right, not moving, but then static can mean being ecstatic or like static electricity, and I do electronic music, so, or you think about a radio when it's just like you're nothing, it's just static, but then it's like craziness within that. Yeah, that's my.
Cool.